right, so this project's going to be split into two parts. This Ed puzzle is the first, and the second will be following right behind it. In this first part, we're discussing the Great Awakening and the French and Indian War. And I'd like to point out before we start that this isn't my slideshow. I borrowed it from another educational website. I just wanted to be upfront about that before we begin. So, before 1750, the colonies, so the 13 colonies, had about 1 million people in them. And the British government, for the most part, let them do their own thing. It was very far away. It was tough for them to exercise total control over the colonies. So they had some level of freedom to work on their own. But they always knew that they were subjects of the British king and that they would pay taxes back to that king and that government. So in the 1730s, the strong religious communities in the United States, they were starting to have some issues. And that's partially because the Puritans were really, really strict. As the name implies, everything had to be pure. They did not put up with any sinfulness. They did not put up with any going against the teachings of God in their eyes. So people at some point started to say, hey, I love God, but this is too tough. I can't quite stick with this. And they started to drift a little bit from the church. And then a minister named George Whitefield arrives from England, and he is one of the leaders of this religious revival known as the Great Awakening. And these guys would come in and they would preach to everybody. They didn't just preach in church. They preached on the streets. They preached in farms. They preached in fields. Wherever they could get people to come and listen to them, they would preach. And it was a lot of fire and brimstone. It was those harsh, angry things still, just like was happening before, but it was also more energy. Okay, and yes, they talked about sins, and they talked about how you needed salvation, and you needed to go to God to get that salvation, but they also taught that everyone could get that salvation, that all people were equals in the eyes of God, and that by going to God, they would find that salvation just as much as their neighbor. So the Great Awakening in this way, it kind of strengthened the ideals of equality, liberty, and self-reliance in the colonies. People started to think, hey, we're just as good as everybody else. We deserve to be free just as much as everyone else, and we can do things on our own. We don't need Britain, and we don't need anyone else looking out for us. But we're still decades away from the American Revolution. So a lot of the French Indian War, as we've discussed, it focuses on the land known as the Ohio River Valley that takes up land in several states right now. So nowadays it's parts of Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, and even part of Pennsylvania there. But back then it was just the Ohio River Valley. And we've discussed how France claimed that area and the area in the west, whereas England had the land in the east. We talked about George Washington going out into the Ohio River Valley to say to the French, hey, England is claiming this, you better get away. And the French said, no, we're good, we're going to stay right here. So then we had that skirmish, that battle at Jumonville, where Washington and the Half King defeated the French soldiers and killed Jumonville. And things started to go wrong. So Washington lost Fort Necessity. Everybody started to get ready for war. England and France are going to go at it for control of North America. And the Native Americans had to pick sides. So again, we have to remember that we can't look at all Native Americans as one big group. They are these small, separated tribes all over the land, and they very often have conflict with each other. So two tribes that were at war with each other would most likely not side with the same European colonial power. So if your two tribes were fighting, you probably wouldn't both be on the side of the French. So there were natives with the English, there were natives with the French, and I believe there were more natives with the French in general, but the English certainly had their fair share as well. So we have this 7 Years' War. It's the French Indian War here in what becomes the United States, but across the rest of the world, the French Indian War is a small conflict in the bigger conflict of the 7 Year War, where England and France are fighting. So the British are losing a lot of battles early in the war. things are not necessarily going their way. Just like at Fort Necessity, the French are pulling off victory after victory, but the British are just too plentiful. They have too many men, they have too many resources, and the tide starts to turn. And in 1759, the British defeat the French at Quebec, and Britain claims huge chunks of Canada, all of the Ohio River Valley, and there are a few other French lands that Spain ended up taking that the English didn't think they would fight for. So, what are the results of the English victory or the British victory in the French and Indian War? Britain becomes the master of North America. The colonies were already British subjects. Now they have control over a lot of land. If you go up to Canada, even till today, the Queen of England is on the money in Canada. So the American colonists, now they have control over the entire Ohio River Valley. They begin moving west a little bit. They're settling areas that had previously been very sparsely populated. The biggest problem, though, is that not only did the French and Indian War cost a lot of money, but the entire process of the 7 Years' War, so these wars all over the world, they really, really hit the British hard, and they were in a lot of debt. They needed to come up with money, and they needed to come up with it quick. And one of the ways that they decided they were going to come up with that money was to start to tax the colonies. It's like, hey, we fought this war for you, British American colonies. You need to pay your fair share. And that is what's going to lead to the beginning of the American Revolution.